excitedly visioning what's coming. So just a reminder to folks, we will be recording today. If you prefer not to be on the record, you can just take your camera and turn off your video. We will be posting this video to our Farm to School BC website. So just wanted to let you know that. If you are okay being recorded, it's so nice to see faces. It's really nice to get a sense of the community out there.
Can I record too?
We'll record it and we will post it to our Farm to School BC website, and you can access it there. Thanks for checking in, Mike.
Okay. All right. I don't need to. Yep. Thank you.
Great. So before we get started, I'd like to take a minute and acknowledge I am calling in from the traditional unceded territory of the Cowetson Nation, who have lived here since time immemorial. My home is above the banks of the Coxsila River, and it's across the valley from Peepalm Mountain, also known as Mount Zuhalem. This river, this mountain, this valley, these are the lifeline of the Cowetson Nation, and I live here as a second-generation settler, constantly humbled and learning how to decolonize my thinking and how to engage in reconciliation in my community. If you would also like to recognize the territory you're calling in from, please put that in the chat. It's really nice to take a moment and acknowledge where we are all coming from. For folks that are new to the workshop this month, my name is Tessa. I am the Central Island Community Animator with Farm to School BC. I wear quite a few hats. I'm also a farmer and a teacher, and I love this work as a community animator because I get to bring together my farming background and my teaching background and my love for community connections. And garden design is of particular interest to me today as well. So a great topic for me to get to be part of presenting today, along with Addie. And I'm going to pass it over to Addie for her to introduce herself.
Awesome, thanks, Tessa. So my name is Addie DeCandle. I am calling in from the unceded ancestral territories of the Esquimalt Songhees nations, modern day Victoria, just outside Victoria. It's been really interesting moving here and getting to know new plants and new water patterns. And we had lots of frost this morning, and now it's a sunshiny day. So I recently moved here from the interior, so it's really nice getting to new landscapes, new weather patterns, new soils, all these new places of our place that we live in. So I am a teacher here in SD62. I teach grade 2 right now, and I'm also the food literacy advisor for Farm to School BC.
Thanks, Addie. Addie, in a minute, we'll launch into our full agenda. But before we do that, I just want to remind folks on the call that we have an amazing guest speaker today. Megan Zinni is joining us, and she'll jump on in the call shortly, and she'll share her knowledge and experience with designing school gardens. Before we launch into the program today, for those that are joining us in the first time in this workshop series, I just want to give you a little bit of a background about Farm to School BC. Farm to School BC is a program that brings healthy, local, sustainable food into schools across British Columbia. We provide students with hands-on learning opportunities that develop food literacy, and we strengthen local food systems while enhancing school and community connectedness. Farm to School BC is a program of the Public Health Association of BC, and we're supported by the Province of British Columbia, as well as the Provincial Health Services Authority. We are organized into 8 different regional hubs across the province, and in each hub we serve 2 to 3 school districts, or more, 4 in some cases. In each hub we also have a community animator and community stakeholders to support the region. And so if you go over to our website, you can get a sense of where the hubs are located and what animators are there to support you. If you fall outside of the hubs and don't have a direct animator, you're always welcome to reach out to Addie and I with questions about the workshops as well. So I will pass it over to Addie to get us started.
So just before we get into the content of our workshop, I just want to have this be a little bit of a reminder to be taking this knowledge, but then thinking about your own garden. So in the chat, think of 2 words to describe your garden. So mine would be, we're trying to build one at our school. I would say planning and sunshine. So just in the chat, let's see what folks have. Oh, I love all these playful ones. Sustainable and shaded. Evolving idea. Small planning, coastal and nourishing. Resting and resilient. Oh, yay. Learning and eating. Non-existent. That's okay. Awesome. So we'll let these keep flowing in, and we'll move on to the next slide here. Thanks for sharing. So in our agenda today, we're going to be starting off hearing from Megan because she's so lovely. We want to hear from her right away. And then we're going to get into school garden goals and purposes. So thinking about the design. Tessa's going to get into the nitty gritty of our design, thinking about where to locate gardens, bed shape, fencing, irrigation, pathways, all of these really important things to think about. And then we're going to end with encourage and how to engage your class with garden design and crop selection, because it's really fun to do with your class, even if it's a bit tricky. We're going to encourage you with some ideas for how you can do this with all of your students and not one more thing that you need to do on your own. So we had initially planned to have crop planning in here, but it just got really jam-packed. We want to make sure we have really enough time for all of this important information. So we will be talking about crop planning a little bit and sharing with you some resources that we have at Farm to School, but we will be getting to crop planning and building garden beds at our March workshop. So right now we are going to hear from Megan, who's going to share her own slides, but I just want to introduce her a little bit. So Megan Zenny is a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia. She has over 25 years of experience teaching in public school, outdoor and garden classrooms. And her two websites I will put in the chat. If you haven't seen them before, there's lots of wonderful ideas that you can use right away in your classroom. I used her water cycle actually unit last week and learning about clouds and everything with our kiddos. So yeah, over to you, Megan. Thanks for joining us.
Great, thank you. You're gonna have to make me a co-host so I can share.
Of course.
So while I'm just waiting for that and getting that set up, I'll just say welcome to everybody. Hello. I am a teacher in the Richmond School District. I teach part-time while I'm working on my PhD, and I teach entirely outdoors. So if you're not familiar with the work that I do, in our school, we've sort of reimagined where and how prep is delivered in our school. So there are two of us actually that teach entirely outdoors. So I am 100% teaching in the outdoor classroom, and the school garden is my classroom. Yeah, that's what I do. And then I'm finishing up my PhD at UBC, and my research looks at how teachers enact education outside the classroom. This is like, I could talk about this topic for probably 6 hours. So I'm going to do it in, how many minutes do I have, Eddie? 10 minutes. You're going to get an information dump of information. I'm just going to talk really high level about some of the things that are really have been important to me. This is the second school garden that we have built at our school property. Just in general, if you're still in the planning stages and you're thinking sustainably about funding, you should know that most wooden garden beds have a lifespan of a maximum of about 12 years. So thinking about, like, don't blow your budget all on one build in the first 5 years, like stagger out your builds so that you can be replacing beds about every decade. You need to be planning for that. If you want to follow along with the work that I do, these are the places on the internet where you can find me. I have lots of Pinterest boards specific to school gardens. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and of course my website. I can see the chat, so if you have any questions as I'm going along, please feel free to drop them there. Okay, so I'm going to speed talk. Going to go super fast. Here we go. All right. When we are thinking about school gardens, so you're looking right now at our original school garden. I want you to spend time in the place and think about how children use the space. So if you are just thinking about designing a school garden, maybe go to another school garden and just watch how kids are using the space and how they move through the space. It's really important when we're designing children's gardens that we're thinking about who they are for. They're not built for adults, they're built for children, and children move through garden spaces much differently than adults do. So if you are redesigning a school garden, watch and spend at least an entire growing season looking at where and how children are congregating and how they're moving through the garden space. When we moved from our old garden to our new garden, we actually rebuilt the garden on the school side of the street. In our situation, we were part of a community garden across a road, and we decided to rebuild on the school side of the street for a number of reasons. I don't have time to go into it tonight, but if you have any questions about it later, maybe I can talk about it. But just remembering that you're looking backwards to look forwards. Like, think about how the space has historically been used. What is the story of the land that you're on? Who has historically and traditionally used these lands? And how do you imagine, and what is your plan for going forward on this land? It was really hard for us to let go of this old garden because we had been in this location for over 12 years, but everything in the garden is a season, and this garden had a season, right? And so we got to start and plan a new one, which was nice. I already mentioned how we rethought about existing teaching roles in the school and using a prep position that already exists in your school to actually dedicate a job to working and teaching in the garden. It is a shared space of learning. We have librarians in our libraries, right? Sarah, who's my teaching partner, she and I are the garden librarians. We manage the inputs, we manage the outputs. Every hour, a different group of kids get to visit the garden, just like kids get to visit the library at the school. It's the heartbeat of our school. And so just reimagining where and how learning happens in your school, and think about existing positions that you already have in place and who might want to fill those. I do have a full blog post on how we created that position on my website. If there's going to be notes from this session, Addie, I can send those to you if you're looking for them directly. Okay, my tips for when you're building a new garden. You want to, like I said, watch the space where you're going to be building for at least one full growing season. Think about how kids are moving through the space. Consider where your access to irrigation is. Choose a really high visibility location to reduce theft. So you can see in this new garden space that we have a large high density building overlooking this garden space. That's useful, right? You've got lots of eyes on the garden. You really want to make sure that you've got access to a good spigot, and you want to carefully measure that your furthest plantings are within at least 100 feet of your spigot, because any decent garden hose is the max you're going to go is 100 feet. So you need to be carefully thinking about that, or you need to work with your municipality or your school district to have more irrigation installed. And that's a big project. So just thinking about that when you're planning. As you're designing this space, really resist the urge to replicate an indoor classroom. The whole point of teaching in a school garden is that we are disrupting how we teach in schools. So it's really a unique opportunity to rethink how we are engaging children in meaningful ways outdoors. You don't have to stack up your garden beds like desks in a classroom, right? I always kind of like, it confuses me when I see a school garden that's all this beds are like lined up like desks in a garden. You can move them around, be creative, like look at the space, look at the kids that are using it, and like it doesn't have to be a bunch of rectangles like desks, okay? You have my permission to go rogue. The other thing I want you to think about, like in this, for example, this garden space, we had a lot of low-lying areas that flooded a lot in the winter. We called it Lake Homa. It was massively flooded and totally unused by kids. So this was a really great opportunity to maximize some of the schoolyard by regrading that area. It wasn't a big project to regrade it. We needed a bulldozer, which we had through the district, and we were able to reallocate that entire massive space for the garden. And I'm going to show you what it looks like from above. We co-designed with our students what we wanted that school garden to look like. Really important to think about what your entry and exit routines are going to be. And think about how kids are going, like, remember, children go over, they never go around. Like if you spent 10 minutes with any kids, you know that they're never going to go around anything, right? So use trellis and other vertical supports strategically to sort of prevent kids from going through and over your garden beds. So you can use those to prevent balls, for example. Like if you've got a school garden that's bumping up against a paved area where there's like square ball and other kids playing, consider putting trellises, or you also have to look at your exposure, right? You don't want to cast shade, but just all of this has to be part of your planning. Where is your sun exposure? Where are the balls coming from? Where are kids going to be running? What are your entry and exit routines? Yeah, just also consider in how you're planting these. Like, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but these beds that we've got staggered at the end, that's where we plant our perennials. So we have our rhubarb and our asparagus and our raspberries and our salmon berries. Those are all in permanent beds that are contained, right? Because we all know that raspberries, salmon berries, those can really become very invasive over time. So you want to make sure you're containing them in a garden bed that isn't going to take over this entire, for example, keyhole garden. The keyhole gardens are reserved for more of our annual crops that we can rotate. So consider the kind of energy you have to put into your school garden off the side of your desk, right? So perennial gardens are generally easier for school gardens than starting fresh every year with annual crops. School gardens certainly don't have to be about food. And I think Addie had used my coin phrase that I talk about all the time about how food is like the least important part of a school garden. We grow a ton of it. We have a very productive garden, but I would say it's the least important part of what we do. There's so many other ways you can engage kids with learning with and on and from the land that doesn't have to grow food. So there's lots of easier and sometimes much more productive gardens that you can grow with children that don't include growing food. Okay, whenever possible, we want to include the children in the building of the garden, right? So in this context, the child labor is excellent, right? It gives them a sense of ownership over the space. It invokes an ethic of care for the garden that they have built. They will take better care of it. And when they become teenagers, they're way less likely to come back and vandalize it. So put those little bodies to work, get all your buckets and get them working. Don't do a work party with adults, get the kids to do the work. It's really important to create gathering spaces. Where are you gathering up? We always start our learning in the garden with a circle, a gathering circle, and we always end in the circle to reflect on the learning that we've done in the garden space. So when you are designing your garden, think about where you're gathering. Where is your talk time going to be? You want to plant strategically for the school year. This is a great mathematical activity, mathematical thinking activity, thinking about crops that you can harvest before the end of June and after September 1st. So on those seed packages, there's a whole year's worth of mathematical thinking on there, all the numeracy that you can do, all the calendar math. Think about when you are planting. So in your home garden, for example, you might be planting beans or carrots for a July or August harvest. You might want to hold off on some of those plantings until the end of June so that you know you can reliably have them ready to harvest in September. There's quite a bit of math you can do with that. I would say resist the urge to grow a massive garden to start, right? Most garden beds are going to last 8 to 10 years. You want to make sure you've got a sustainability plan in place. Also resist the urge to plant a giant orchard or other really high maintenance plantings that might not thrive in our current changing climate conditions. And also think about your legacy. Don't be the teacher that the district works yard 10 years from now has to bring in a bulldozer to get rid of all the raspberries or the mint or the, you know, I'm thinking of some other ones like lemon balm, for example, that you planted not knowing how invasive it was going to be. Don't plant blackberries. Like all of those really invasive plants, make sure you have a plan for them, put them in metal troughs. You got to think about what you're planting, where you're planting it, and what the fallout of those plantings are going to be. Okay, I'm watching my time. I know it's up. I'm just going to say one more thing. Create zones for playing and learning. It's really important that when we are designing children's gardens, they should invite children in. And the whole purpose of childhood is play, right? So design it for durability, design it for yes spaces. So for example, kids want to dig. Yes, they want to dig in your gardens, right? But we're going to create a dig pit for them, which is attached to your mud kitchen. And I have a whole blog post on this, that you can give them shovels. And when you see them wanting to dig, you say, you go dig in the dig pit. We don't dig in the garden beds, right? So those yes spaces are really important. Yes, you can dig, but you cannot dig in the garden beds. Go dig in the dig pit, right? You want to add play spaces to add layers of complexity and joyfulness to the garden. It shouldn't just be somewhere that kids are going in May and June once a week. It should be somewhere the dailiness of it is really important, and that includes play. I have lots more to say, but I know my time is up, so I'm going to stop. I had a lot of examples examples of play to give. But
No, it's wonderful. I realize that a lot of what we're talking about today is going to be overlapping a lot with this. So if you want a few more minutes, Megan, if you
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Can I give some more
I'm just-
examples?
Yeah, I think that's great. Thanks.
Okay. I'm going to talk about 3 examples of play that I think every school garden should have. Okay.
Right.
Number 1, every school garden should have a bug hotel. So bug hotels are really important for school gardens because they provide an actionable way for students to demonstrate compassion and empathy for all living things, right? So when we see insects and bugs, we want to replace that fear and anxiety with compassion and curiosity, right? So kids who don't have any relationship with the more than human world will often want to step on, cut them in half, and murder them in some way, right? But we don't have homicide in our curriculum. We have compassion and empathy in our curriculum. And so we want to create a sort of destination holiday resort for all of the pests in our garden. So at your home garden, you might have all kinds of baits and traps and ways to murder the pests in your garden. But in a school garden, we're not doing that. In a school garden, we are showing compassion and empathy. So we create a little hotel, and then we can do some research on what kind of habitats do slugs and snails like. And then we can create a little hotel room for them and pop them in there to take them out of the garden, right? So we're going to learn who is helping our garden and who is not helping our garden, who are our friends and who are our pests. We're going to build a bug hotel away from our growing space. Kids will spend years renovating and building up the bug hotel. It doesn't have to be fancy. This is just a pallet and some straw and some pine cones. You can fill it with anything you want. So bug hotels, I have a full blog post on this on my website as well. Dinosaur gardens are really important. If you have a particularly weedy patch, anybody looking at this knows that horsetail is impossible to get rid of in a school garden. It's just, don't even try to wage a war with it. Just add a dinosaur. So throw some dinosaurs in. It becomes a play area. All the feet playing in there, all the dinosaurs in there will kind of tamp it down a bit. If you've got a lot of weeds in your school garden, make it a play space. A lot of kids don't love the sort of boisterousness of recess and lunch. They like small world play. They like the fantasy play. Create spaces for that. It draws them into the garden place. So if you've got weeds, add a dinosaur. I do have a full blog post on this as well on my website if you want to read more information on that. Fairy gardens are super essential in school gardens. You can tuck them into pollinator gardens or perennial garden beds. They're really important for providing a quiet respite. It's a low intensity play space in the garden for students who might not enjoy the noise or chaos of recess or lunch. Fairy gardens are also an excellent entry point for small world and fantasy play that's really easily integrated into writing and story play that you want to do in your school garden. I'm going to talk about mud kitchens really quick. Mud kitchens are essential for every school garden. Got to have one. They normalize mud play. They provide opportunities for garden specific play. It helps keep small group of learners occupied while you're working with a small group of children. If you've never worked with a group of children in a school garden, I'm here to tell you, you cannot go around a school garden bed with 20 kids. Don't even try it. You need to have 5 or 6 kids at a time that you're teaching. The rest of them, you use a stations or centers approach where they're working independently on small tasks. If you don't have tables, you can lay out tarps that become like little carpets in your garden. You can put table tasks on your tarp. Mud kitchens are a great way to keep kids independently learning and playing while you are working 4 or 5 kids at a time. And it allows that school garden to become a really joyful, playful space where children feel welcomed. Okay, I'm going to stop now. Again, if you want to follow along with the work that I do, these are the places you can find me. I'll answer any questions that I see come up. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Megan. I feel like I've heard you talk, but like as I'm doing this work, it just keeps like, I understand more and more of it every time, and like as my daughter is 5 and there are so many fairies all over our garden, but she will play with them all the time. Tessa, I think you'll have to exit out and then reshare it because we can see the, it's not in the presenter mode. Thank you. All these little bugs of presenting. Yeah, if folks have any questions, you can write them in the chat. We had one about salmon berries. What are they?
Salmon berries are a native species of berry that fruits early in coastal areas. They're they've been here since time immemorial. There's lots of really good information and resources on them. There's
Great.
some beautiful books. If you speak to some of your elders, Indigenous elders in your community, I'm sure they would have lots to tell you about them.
Cool. And I like somebody's comment that they need more yes spaces in their life. Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Megan. That was really fun. So I'm going to repeat a lot of what Megan was saying as we get into our next section of our workshop. We're going to be talking about school garden goals and designs here. So at the last workshop, we talked about don't do it all by yourself. This is a huge work that's over many, many decades, and we don't want you to do all this work on your own because you're going to burn out and it's not sustainable. So building your committee, thinking about your goals, building those connections are going to create a more sustainable school garden for you. So we're going to talk a little bit more about goals right now. So it's really easy for grown-ups to think about building spaces for other grown-ups. So we think about the built environment. Where are our beds going to go? Where's the garden going to be? What's the solar exposure? Where's the irrigation? And also, how much money do I have? Who's going to help me on this? Those are the pieces that the grown-ups are involved in and they can really understand. But if we take a step back, we would like you, if you don't remember anything else from today, but think about how the students are going to use the space. Grown-ups are going to be designing the space for grown-ups really easily. But like Megan suggested, looking, if you have an existing school garden, see where students are using the space already. The built environment is going to influence how students use that space. So when you're thinking about the garden, you need to keep these three factors in balance. And where they meet at the middle is where you're going to have this beautiful garden design that's going to work for the students and create rich learning opportunities, which is what we want. So when I think about a problem, I like to think about it in terms of questions. So if we take a step back from these three influences, if we're thinking about, our number system messed up. Oh, well, 1, 2, and 3. 1, how do we want the students to use the garden? Again, the garden is for them. So we need to be prioritizing how our children and our students are going to be using the space. Then we can think about how can we design the garden to support those activities? And then lastly, what are our constraints? We don't have all the money and time in the world. So what is going to be limiting the factors in our garden design? Maybe it's time or money or gardening skills. So that's why you're here joining us on our year-long adventure together. Maybe it's school district or admin support, whatever it is, but be thinking of things with the students first. So I just want to look at this picture together. So when I look at this example from a school garden, I'm seeing, well, I might be thinking, how are students going to use this space? It looks like it has really wide pathways. I see some fruit trees. I see probably some perennials, which are wonderful, as Megan mentioned. You don't have to plant them every year. They just come back. It's amazing. There's probably some flowers mixed in there as well. And in the built environment, you have a big fence that's surrounding it. It looks like it's in front of the school, so it's got really high visibility. And for the capacity and constraints, it looks like this was expensive to put in. Chain link fences are expensive, and there's some fruit trees and things in there, which would really create some like long-term uses of the space, but really be thinking, okay, how are we going to use all that fruit when it's all coming off the tree? So Tessa's just going to talk a little bit more about this garden here.
So digging into this a bit deeper, I'll give you a little bit of background. This is a garden at Dover Bay Secondary in North Nanaimo. And so from my interactions with this garden, I'll answer those same 3 questions. So in terms of how students are using this space, this is a phenomenal project of a student-run leadership eco club. And so this space is actually the gathering space weekly for the eco club at this school. And it's organized by a group of students, and they have up to 50 or 60 students in their eco club that comes to this food forest, gathers, and then also does other initiatives around the school, like garbage and recycling, native plant. They've designed this garden specifically for seed saving. So yes, they have lots of perennials. They call it a food forest because they have this multiple layers of perennials shaded under fruit trees, and they grow lots of plants. They then save the seeds for, and then they have an annual fundraising event with their seeds that they save. They also have a section in here that they raise native plants for their separate native plant garden, and they have another bed that's dedicated just to potatoes, and they have a big annual potato party. So those are a few uses that you might not see from the photo, but take a dig a bit deeper. In terms of the built environment, this was built over a lot of years. This is a project of many people, multiple grants, and a lot of time. And so that built environment has changed, and you can see how established the fruit trees have become and the perennial plants too. In terms of capacity and constraints, I think because this has been a long-term project with lots of support, it's right at the front of the school, it's really visual, it's a flagship of the school. There has been significant support, but it's also been wisely planned in that they didn't bite it all off at once and build a huge garden. This has been a labor of love for many years. So digging into those 3 questions a bit deeper with the background of the Dover Bay Garden, hopefully helps us practice how to answer those questions for our own projects.
So school gardens can have a lot of different components, and they're going to look different in every school. A lot of them, some might have similar components, but it's going to depend on what's going on at your school, what your interests are in your committees, and think what's going to work for our environment and at our school for the long term. Yeah, I see Mike asking about wheelchair. We will be getting into accessibility examples at a bit later on. So I'm just going to go through this a bit quickly. So this is on our program library page. We've developed a worksheet, and it focuses on these three different garden types. Obviously, there's different components. You can mix and match what's going to work for you. So we're going to be talking about perennial gardens, outdoor classrooms, and vegetable production. So for perennial gardens, you might see lots of flowers. They're plants that are going to come back every year, so they're really easy to maintain, thinking about how they're going to be used. Maybe you have some beekeeping, like the school in Kitimat. There's lots of different ways that perennials can be incorporated into a garden. And it makes it a lot easier to manage because you don't have to replace everything year after year. So as an example, Megan mentioned the bug hotel. You might be supporting more pollinator species. I mean, I think everybody should have strawberries in their garden. The students can be picking them and they're going to come back all the time. You might be having bird feeders, some signage. There's lots of different things that you can incorporate. For some Indigenous languages, there's lots of really cool things. When we're thinking about an outdoor classroom, we're making sure that if the intention of the space is to disrupt the classroom and take your learning outside, which we think is really important, make sure that you have space for 30 people to fit. There's so many school gardens that I've seen over the years that there are not enough within the confines of the fence of the space that not an entire class can fit in the school garden. So there's enough tools for everybody. There is food being produced, but it's not the overall intention of the space. Tessa, we can be going through these pretty quick here. So when you're thinking about an outdoor classroom, making sure that there's playful furniture, there's tables and benches and space for students to be working at, making sure there's enough tools for everybody. If you want to have, 2 trowels, don't really make sense. Make sure you have enough for 10 or 25 students to be using, little bug observation things, whatever you'd like to be doing. Our third example is really focusing on vegetable production. So they might have raised beds that are growing food, maybe in a secondary school, maybe they're growing food for the foods department. There's a lot more emphasis on growing food for a specific reason. Maybe it's to be preserved later, maybe it's going to be eaten fresh and incorporated into a fresh breakfast program, whatever it is. But the focus really here would be to grow the most amount of vegetable and produce possible. So this infrastructure, incorporating a washing station, food preservation, maybe you're growing heirloom tomatoes because you want to be selling them at the farmer's market. There's going to be a lot more summer involvement here. So be thinking, what is going to work for our school? Is this the intention for our garden space? So on our Learning from the Land toolkit, we have a section on native plant resources, which is a really great resource. So I just wanted to highlight that a little bit. I'll share the link in the chat in a minute. So again, taking these influences into consideration with the students' use, your built environment, and your capacity, right there in the middle of the Venn diagram is going to be your sweet spot. How can we build this space for students within our capacity? You're going to have some gold there.
Thanks, Addie. I really love Addie's kind of framework for this, that we really want to do this backward design approach where we're considering how the students are going to use the space and then working backwards to how we want to design the space. And for teachers, I think we're really familiar with that, thinking about what we want students to learn and then designing your own units and lessons backward from that. So thanks, Addie. Okay, we're ready to dive in a bit deeper to the nitty-gritty. How are we actually going to go about designing this? So take a moment if you need to stretch, refill your water glass. We're going to enter the last section of this workshop looking at our garden design. We're going to approach this. We're first going to look at choosing your location, and then we're going to look at designing within that location. Throughout this section, if you have questions, please put them in the chat bar. If we have time at the end, Addie will share some of those questions. I will also stay on the call for an extra kind of 10-15 minutes at the end. So if you have any more specific questions and we don't get a chance to get to them in the chat, I will answer them at the end. And also a reminder, you can always bring your questions to our discussion groups, which follow next week. So first, we're going to look at choosing a location. And Megan did an awesome job of sharing some of the factors that we want to consider with choosing a location, and I'll share a few more. So the first thing we want to consider is our sun and wind exposure. Looking around your school garden, you'll have all these different microclimates. South sides of buildings, full sun, you'll have these warm pockets. North sides of buildings, you'll have the cool pockets. You want to consider where would be the best area for growing. Typically, you want full sun or at least partial sun and a warm area. Kids do not want to stand around in the wind in the garden. This example is from one of the schools I worked at, and this is a garden bed right on the south side of a building, no trees around, and there was a group of students that wanted to do, they called it the Three Brothers Garden, reminiscent of the Three Sisters Garden with corns, beans, and squash. They wanted a really hot location for it. So we picked that spot as a great location for those heat-loving plants. This is an interesting time of year that with these frosty mornings, you can actually take a walk around your school garden mid-morning and see where's the frost still on the ground. And that helps you identify some of those microclimates. Just keeping in mind that the sun angle will change and the direction, the location where it's rising and falling as well will change as you enter into our growing season. But observation is so key. I love what Megan said, like spend a year getting to know a site before you start to build. School gardens are really hard to move. You want to make a decision in the beginning about the best spot to put it. So really consider sun and wind exposure when you're looking at that. Next, like Megan said, water access is key. I feel like I've seen so many school gardens where you're hooking together hose after hose and running them across gravel pathways and driveways, and you really want to make sure you're as close to water as possible. Ideally, you have a faucet in your garden. You want to be aware if that faucet is something that you have control over year-round, if you're able to turn on and off the water in the summer and over spring breaks too. If this is a garden where you're wanting irrigation, you also want to look at, is that faucet or is that water access able to be hooked up to irrigation? So consider water. This is like the make or break of so many gardens and so much easier to plan around that in the beginning. Next, vehicle access. It's easy to think, oh, we're going to design a garden, we're going to bring in 20 yards of soil and then not think about the piece of how are we going to get the soil into the garden. If you have access to a vehicle, it makes it so much easier. Kids love to unload soil from a truck. So think about how you can bring your materials year after year into the garden. The next thing is thinking about soil, and there's a few options there. Some gardens use the existing soil on the school ground and other gardens rely on bringing soil in. If you're using the existing soil on your school ground, you're going to want to explore, see how deep your topsoil is. Do a soil pit with your class. It's a great learning opportunity to dig down, see what you hit underneath the topsoil. If you're bringing in soil, you'll want to know, do you have access to good soil nearby? Soil can actually be really hard to locate and purchase. I hear complaints from school gardens that they brought in soil and it brought invasive plants with it, or it brought a lot of weeds into your garden. So make sure you have a good source if you are bringing in soil. Soil can also be a large portion of your budget. So a great math lesson is calculate the size of your raised beds, calculate the volume, how many yards you're going to need to make sure that you're planning in accordance with your budget. A nice kind of happy medium between tracking in all your soil to fill your raised garden beds versus digging up the soil that's on the site is either lasagna gardening, also known as sheet mulching. And that's the concept where if you see the picture on the right here on the slide, over top of the existing soil, it's probably grass, you're laying down cardboard or newspaper. And then on top of that, you're putting layers of green and brown material, nitrogen-rich material like grass clippings and manure, layered with straw and leaves, back and forth till you get to your top layer, which would be a mix of compost and topsoil. Basically, you're just creating a giant compost pile that over the years will break down and turn into soil at the same time as the cardboard that was a barrier to the weeds is also breaking down, and the worms and the great microorganisms in the soil are coming up into your garden bed. And so it can be a great way of turning existing soil into a garden without having to bring in all the fresh yards of soil for your project. It's also super fun with kids to build a lasagna outside, and you can often source the leaves and the grass clippings from the community around your school too. So it can be a good community building opportunity. One other thing to think of if you are using the existing soil, some people like to do a soil test, not just to know about the nutrients in the soil, but also to know if there's any contaminants in the soil that you should be aware of. So one other thing to think about there. Another thing with choosing location, like Megan said, visibility is huge. You really want the garden to be on people's minds. It's great if parents can see it as they're coming into the school, kids see it. Gardens that are out of sight get so much more neglected. I know my own garden, the plants that I walk by every day are the ones that get watered and cared for. So think about visibility. And maybe you can even think outside the parameters of your schoolyard. This example on the screen is Bayview Elementary. And they've made a highly visible garden by putting their garden beds on the city-owned boulevard that's adjacent to the school. In doing so, they have a great connection with the community, and it's been really well supported by the community because it's actually public accessible space. The downside to that is students need to be with their teacher. They can't visit the garden at recess because it's outside of their schoolyard. But I just encourage you to think creatively, think outside of the schoolyard, think about all your options when you're choosing the location, and take time. Because there's a lot of different factors to consider and different merits with different places. So once you're feeling great about your location, the next step is to design your garden within that location. So I'm going to talk through a few of the factors you want to consider with actually designing your garden. I feel like Megan, Addie, and I perhaps are overloading you with information, and I want you to just rest assured that there is worksheets that correspond with this on the Farm to School BC website. And I will also share a couple of toolkits that are online that do a great job of talking through these factors that I'm talking through in much more detail. So you can refer back to these things to really apply this situation to your garden. So in terms of garden design, one of the first things to think about is garden layout. And I really like what Megan said is we're not recreating the classroom. These do not need to be garden beds all aligned in a row outside. That said, when you're designing your garden, you also want to have in mind, how are you going to maintain that garden? What capacity do you have to maintain it? I know when I go to design a garden, my head thinks of like herb spirals and edible snack tracks and whimsical bean teepees. And that's great until you like try to maneuver a wheelbarrow through, or try to irrigate across garden beds, or want to mow the grass between these like spiraling gardens. So yeah, it's part dreaming up this creative, wonderful design based on how you envision kids will use the space. And the other part is thinking of your capacity and thinking of your ability to maintain that space. The picture here is a nice mix that it is the periphery of the garden has a very like linear square garden bed that was really easy for us to run drip irrigation to. But then the center of the garden has a compass rose garden with a teepee in the middle and invites different use of space. So do think about how you can maybe mix the creative design with the practical as well. Here's just an example of that, where there are the more kind of practical garden beds mixed in with some more creative areas, some communal areas like pollinator gardens, healing gardens, and maybe bean towers. So a bit of a mix of the two different designs. Here's another different design in that they've run their garden all the way on the periphery of their sports field. So again, thinking outside the box, gardens can look so different, and really consider the location and the design elements that are fit your garden and your space. Beyond the layout, you also want to think about what type of garden beds are we going to build. The most common is the planter boxes that are connected to the soil underneath. You will sometimes see raised planter boxes that have a bottom. This is really useful if you're on gravel, if you're on asphalt, that sort of thing. Another option that some people might be new to some people is the picture on the top here. Oh, sorry. And those are growing sacks. So these are these fabric growing sacks that you can grow within. The great thing about raised planter boxes and growing sacks is you have a lot less weeding to do. But the challenge is they do require more water because they dry out more quickly. The growing sacks or the raised planter beds can be great if you're creating a more temporary space. They can be easily moved around the schoolyard. Perhaps you're creating a pilot project and are not ready to yet put in permanent infrastructure. The last option is growing in the ground. If you have great topsoil and want to create more of a almost like micro farm at your school, digging right into the ground can work well. Whatever garden bed you're looking at, you want to be really mindful about the width of the garden bed. It's challenging for adults and kids to reach more across a bed that's wider than 30 inches. I find 30 inches works great. Some people bump it up to 36 inches, but just be mindful that the garden bed is accessible, especially to our littler learners, our kindergarten kids. They can't reach as far into the beds. So you want to make it really accessible for them. Another thing when you're designing is to consider your pathways. Like Megan said, kids don't go around things. So really consider, where is the traffic flow going to go? How can we encourage kids to explore the garden in a way that invites them into all the spaces while protecting the garden plants? You also want to think about material. The most common one is probably wood chips, which is great, but it's not accessible in terms of students with wheelchairs. The chips can really get stuck in wheelchair wheels. Or if you're bringing elders into your garden, it's hard for walkers too. The great thing about wood chips is you could often get them for free. If a local arborist company is doing some work, they'll often bring the chips over. So consider the different material options. I have seen gravel as well, and I've also often seen grass that you just mow it as well. Again, we want to think about maintenance. Who's going to maintain the aisles in the summer, especially if it's grass? This just speaks to that garden layout. This is a garden that a colleague designed, and he mentioned that between garden beds 11 and 12 here, the kids always went through it, and that's fine. You put a stepping stone there, and I think that was their solution as well. The kids will let you know the traffic routes that are needed in a garden. Another design feature is to think of your fencing. The two most common things I see are deer fencing, some people call it agriculture fencing, which is featured in the top picture, and chain link, which is featured in the bottom. Chain link is more expensive, but sometimes school districts require it. There's lots of other fencing options too, but these seem to be the most common with school gardens. The other thing you want to think about is gates. I really like Megan's comment about thinking about how students are entering and exiting the garden, how you're learning, how your lesson is flowing through their entry and exit into the garden. So where are the gates? Where are the gathering spaces as well? And ideally, you have multiple entries and exits to your garden. Another thing to consider is irrigation. If you are fortunate enough to have irrigation on your school garden, that's wonderful. But you will want to think about, if you're going to irrigate, think about that early in the design, because how you lay out the beds will either make it easier or harder for your irrigation. I see drip irrigation being the most common in school gardens, and it can be hard to run drip irrigation between multiple beds over pathways. And so consider that. You also want to look at your faucet, see if you're able to put a timer on that faucet, because that will make your summer so much easier and the garden more productive through those dry months. Another big thing to consider is accessibility. So in terms of accessibility, you want to think about those pathways. I mentioned before that the chips can be really challenging for wheelchairs or walkers to move through. And so paved or pea gravel can be a solution to that. With your garden beds, there's so many neat ideas for making accessible garden beds out there, both for our little learners that can't reach to tall beds and also for folks in wheelchairs or walkers that want to access a garden bed. The picture here is a garden bed that I built at a community inclusion garden, and I loved this design. There's entry points, 2 on the back and 1 on the front that you're seeing for a wheelchair or a walker to pull up to, and really be part of the group that's at the garden box. There's also those little benches, and the younger kids like to stand on those benches and reach the garden bed. The tilted design of it too means that it requires a lot less soil to fill it. So there's lots of great designs out there for accessible garden beds, and it's great to include that thinking as you're starting to design your garden. Another reminder with tools to make those accessible, the mini wheelbarrows are awesome for our little learners. And just make sure you have a good variety of your tools. There's so much more we can go into in terms of making gardens inclusive. If people want to chat with me later, I'd love to talk about it. I worked as an inclusion garden coordinator, and it's a passion of mine. But there's a great resource on the web. It's called Increasing Inclusion in School Gardens, and they have a whole chapter about design features that help create inclusion in school gardens. So take a look at that for more information, or reach out to me as well. Another toolkit for helping you design your school garden is put out by Kids Gardening, the Seeds of Success Toolkit, and they have a lengthy chapter all about garden planning and design. It touches on the topics that Megan, Addie, and I have talked about today, but goes into more detail. So it's a great reference to refer back to. And again, both these resources will be posted in our program library on the Farm to School BC website. Lastly, I just want to say, involve your students. The design process is so fun. Kids love to imagine spaces, draw maps, create models. Something I've had a lot of success with my class was the picture there on the top right is I brought in a whole bunch of wooden sticks and hot glue guns, and we built models of the garden. And it was such a great visual, and we were able to share our models and pick some ideas from that for us to move forward with our garden design. So I really encourage that tactile, hands-on way of envisioning the garden. As always, it's an opportunity to connect curriculum. You can connect any big idea to your garden, but garden design is a rich place for connecting curriculum with ADST, math, science. Get outdoors, get your physical movement in. You can like lay out your garden with your class, peg it in, put ropes around where the garden beds are going to be, map it out, measure it out. It can be a nice way to visualize it. Great way to check traffic, like mark it all out on the ground and then see how kids move through that space. See if you put the pathways in the right space. So just encouraging you to include your learners in that process. Lastly, a reminder, start small, keep it simple. It's wonderful to have a big vision. Where do you want your garden to be in 5 years? Where do you want it to be in 10 years? But today, in this year, start small. Maybe you start with 3 beds and you're building to 10 beds over time. Maybe you're building a food forest. You start with 1 guild and you add guilds every year. Start small and build up from there. Dream big, start small. So that was a really quick overview of choosing the location and garden design. And we're going to pass it back to Addie to talk a little bit about crop planning.
So we had big dreams of talking a lot about crop planning in this workshop, but obviously it's jam-packed full of information. So, but we did promise it. So I just want to, I'm going to put the link right now in the chat. We have a bunch of resources. If you could go to the next page, of some crop planning things. So we have, if folks are familiar with the West Coast Seed planting guide, they have 3 calendars for all over BC. So we've adapted those calendars and shifted the dates a little bit so that things are not ready in July and August. So we have one for the north, one for the interior, and one for coastal BC. And you can check on our website on the link that I just shared and think about, okay, we don't have any summer capacity, but what can we plant right now in our region that we can be harvesting in June or earlier if you're lucky enough to have a bit of longer of a season. We also have these crop cards that you can see on the left. This is an example of what the crop planning charts look like. Sorry, Tessa. So the crop cards, we have about 10 or so for spring crops. So they are things that you can plant soon, depending on where you live in the continent. I saw we had somebody from Maine, and Anthony's back from New York. Hi, Anthony. So we have our spring harvest crop cards. So these are things that you can be planting soonish and harvesting before school is out. So on the seed packet, they are wonderful and they're full of information, but they're very small and can be hard to distribute. So we've kind of taken that information and extrapolated it into a 2-page handout. So you can print them double-sided, or 4 to a page work really well. And then get your students thinking about how far apart should these seeds be? How far apart do the rows need to be? And again, this is getting a little bit more into planting, but we want you to be thinking about these things when you're designing it. So what's your timeline on designing and building your garden so that things can, yeah, maybe you'll have a harvest before the end of June, which will be very exciting. Yes, Karen, thank you. West Coast Seeds, they have guides for other parts of Canada too. Fabulous. So how are you feeling? One word. Write it in the chat. I like to do a bit of a one-word checkout. Oh boy. Excited. Yay. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing. It's nice to just get a bit of a pulse on Zoom chats. We're probably going to go a couple of minutes over today. So if you need to go right at 4:30, please just feel free to sign off. Awesome. Thank you for sharing. So we have our discussion group, again, following this workshop next Thursday. So it's at the same time, 3:30 to 4:30, and it's quite open. So our theme for this group is school garden examples and types. So if you want to come back, you want to dig in a little bit, you've had a week and a bit to digest. We just gave you so much information. If you want to rewatch this or look at the slides, they'll be available on our website by Thursday morning at the latest. So check that out. If you want to come back and chat with us, we'll be more than happy to talk to you. And our next workshop is March 7th. So it's coming up a little bit earlier because of spring break across the province. So it'll be in 3 weeks, I guess, right? Yeah, 3 weeks. And that's a bit more of, okay, so we've talked about how to design the garden, and now we're going to be talking about how you're actually going to build the garden and what seeds you need to be planting so that you're ready to go for after spring break. How to build a grow station, building your beds, and again, those connections, building that community help. So the discussion group, we realized some people will be on spring break, but it is what it is. The March 16th will be the following discussion group after that. Sorry, Tessa, I think you were going to talk about these, weren't you?
Oh, you are on a roll, Addie. Keep going. Keep going.
We have a farm to school conference. It's going to be so fun. It's in May at UBC. So our call for proposals, the deadline got extended. They're now due February 22nd. If you'd like to present at our conference, if you want to come talk to other educators about their school gardens and other things that they have going on, we would love to see you there. We also have a Indigenous Foodways webinar tomorrow, right after school. I just put the link in the chat. It'll be really fun. It's with Dr. Danielle Sims, who's going to be speaking and sharing about Indigenous food in the North. So it'll be wonderful. Do you want to talk about this, Tessa? I feel like
Sure.
you were all ready.
We just wanted to remind you that we have a team with Farm to School here ready to support you. Again, go to our website, see if you fall within one of our regional hubs, and reach out to the community animator, or as always, reach out to Addie or I to follow up with questions as well. Just wanted to let you know that we're here. And you'll find on this slide, there are our email addresses. So feel free to reach out.
Yay. And if you could let us know what you thought of the workshop today. We have a discussion group. If there's anything that we missed or you'd like to provide feedback on, it would be great to hear from you. So you can do that in the survey. So we are going to stop the recording now. And if you'd like to sign off, then please feel free. Or if you have a few minutes that you would like to stay on, then we will be happy to talk to you.